This is the
Spartan Podcast.
where we illuminate the world of parenting children with autism. I'm CJ, a proud dad to a wonderful 6-year-old with autism. Through my journey, I've discovered the challenges, triumphs, and unique experiences that come with raising a child on the spectrum. Inspired by those experiences, I created this space where parents like you can find understanding, share stories, and learn from each other. Join me as we explore insights, strategies, and support, all while celebrating the brighter spectrum of our children's lives. Now, let's dive in and cast light on this path together. As parents of children with ASD, a lot of us sit down and wonder and often scratch our heads wondering why our kids refuse to eat things, especially new things or things of the wrong color, or things that might be cooked a little bit more than they normally are, or something they came out of the wrong packaging. Baffling. Sitting down with me today is the director of the feeding program, professor of pediatrics at PennState Medical University, and author, Dr. Keith Williams. Dr. Keith, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I really appreciate the time you've given me to do this, and I'm very excited to have you here.
No, it is absolutely my pleasure. And you're right, it is a challenge for many parents, and it is baffling of why these kids just are so selective in many ways.
Just before sitting down here to talk with you, I just had my son out to lunch, and he ate mozzarella sticks for the first time, and I was over there celebrating that he put this new food in his mouth, and people were looking at me like I'm crazy. And I know it's junk food, but I was just so excited that he ate something new. And honestly, I give your book Broccoli Boot Camp credit for the information that I learned and the methods that I'm using to get these new foods introduced to him. And I'm sure parents listening right now are saying like, "Oh man, he ate something new." Yes, my child has eaten 4 new food items since acquiring Dr. Keith Williams' book Broccoli Boot Camp. And it's one of the reasons I'm so excited for sitting down here with him today. But before we really get into the meat of that, Dr. Keith, can you talk to us a little bit about yourself?
Sure.
Your history, the amount of years you've been doing this, how
Okay.
long you've been with Penn State?
Sure. Well, I have been working with children with feeding problems since 1989. I worked at a place called the Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is part of Johns Hopkins. And I was there from 89 to 97. And I was recruited by the Hershey Medical Center to come to Hershey and start a feeding program. So I have been here as the director of the feeding program since 1997. So this is my 27th year of working here in Hershey and trying to help kids learn to eat a wider variety of foods, and in some cases try to eat more foods or eat it all, since I see some kids that are dependent on tube feeds.
That's insane. So tube feeding, is that something that like is because like a physical disability, or is this just kids that refuse to eat? Like, why do they have to use that?
It can be both. We do in many cases we do see kids with a lot of medical issues. So they might have reflux, they might have cardiac issues or pulmonary issues, and they just can't sustain themselves by mouth. So they get a tube. They might get a tube put down their nose, a nasogastric tube, or they may get a tube inserted into their abdomen, a gastrostomy tube. So there's a number of different types of tubes, but essentially their nutrition is going through that tube and not in their mouth and down their esophagus. So we work on trying to get kids to eat more food or eat a wider variety so they're not dependent on those tube feeds.
And what would you say is more common, a child with some sort of like an eating disorder, or just general pickiness, or like a psychological thing that doesn't let them consume other foods?
Well, they're like, if you look at the population we see, by far the biggest group of kids we see are kids that are selective eaters. And food selectivity is there's a range, just like autism is on a spectrum. So you'll see kids that and with autism that may be nonverbal and some are very verbal, or they may have different social abilities. But not every kid with autism looks alike, and that's true about the feeding part as well. You'll see some kids that are so selective that they develop nutrient deficiencies, while you'll see some other kids that they're selective, but they eat enough that you don't worry about their nutrition. They're gaining adequate weight, and it's something that it would be nice to work on over time, but it's not an immediate health concern. Um, Many kids are like that, and many kids are like that because they would get supplementation of some form. Maybe they'll take a multivitamin, maybe they'll take oral supplements like Pediasure or Boost or Kid Essentials or something like that. So they may be at risk for having a nutritional deficiency, but they correct that by taking some kind of supplemental nutrition. But the majority of kids we see are selective eaters, but it's just a pretty wide variety of how selective they are.
So, like with my son specifically, he has that really stereotypical, um, sort of like safe food range where it's like
Mhm.
chicken nuggets and pizza rolls and uncrustables and butter noodles and rice and mozzarella sticks now, and pretty much most chicken products. Uh, his preferred one is chicken nuggets though, and I see
Right,
that a lot of parents talk about like a lot of those foods specifically are really common for like what their kids will selectively eat. Like that's what they want for every meal. And when
right,
I brought that up to my son's pediatrician, he had told me as long as he eats something a little bit like peanut butter or gets some honey in him, that the diet itself is fine as long as we supplement his like gastrointestinal system with something like Miralax. Um, is that like a sort of thing that's common, or maybe I
well,
should get a second opinion on that? What do you
well,
think?
I mean, no, I mean, um, what we know is there's a number of what they call essential vitamins and minerals. And what the essential means is we need to have them to survive. And some of those would include food or like iron. You have to have iron because that's what helps make red blood cells. You have to have vitamin C. You have to have vitamin A. So if your diet has to have all of those things, you don't have to necessarily take them through food if you get them through a multivitamin or if you get them through some other type of supplement. But your body does have to have them. It's pretty common for us, really, to see kids with something that's called scurvy, and that's a vitamin C deficiency. So they're just not taking in juice, they're not taking in any fruits, they don't take any vegetables, they don't take a multivitamin. So they end up with this deficiency, which causes a number of health problems.
Hmm.
So your child's diet may be absolutely fine, but the question is, does he get all these essential vitamins and minerals? And those are what they call micronutrients. And then the other half of that is what they call macronutrients. That's protein, carbohydrates, and fats. So your kid needs those as well. And does your diet provide those things? I mean, just from what you've said, your child's diet seems pretty good. Seems like it's not very wide in the fruit and vegetable groups, but uh, that's true with many kids in general.
Mhm.
So it's just a matter of, is your child able to get what they need from their diet?
Okay. Yeah, normally with him it's like he'll eat a banana anytime you hand it to him. And apples, he'll drink apple juice. He'll drink a carton of that a day if you let him. Um and if you give him actual apple slices, he will chew on them, suck all of the juice out of them, and then spit the pulp out,
Mm.
which
But
is loads
I
of
think
fun.
what you just mentioned is important. Your kid drinks apple juice. um, a lot of times you hear parents say they don't want to give their kid juice, or maybe the pediatrician told the parent not to give the child juice. I think that's not good advice for every child because children are different.
Hmm.
For some children, their source of vitamin C is juice because they don't necessarily eat fruits that have a lot of vitamin C, or they eat no fruits, or they eat no vegetables. So they don't get any other source except for their juice. So I don't tell parents not to give juice because in some cases, juice is what the child has to get their vitamin C in. And your child drinks apple juice, so they're going to be absolutely fine for vitamin C.
When it comes to vitamin C, what about those like powder drink mixes, like like in that Kool-Aid range? Like I think Hawaiian Punch does it, and I know Tang does it, where it says it's got a full value of
They,
vitamin
yeah,
C.
um, a lot of the fruit drinks, they will add vitamin C. Um, the other place you see vitamin C is if you go to McDonald's and you order those little packs of apples that never seem to turn brown.
Hmm.
That's because they've added vitamin C to them. Ascorbic acid or vitamin C is a preservative. That's why they put it in juice all the time. And they put it in juice because they know that it's a thing parents are looking for. So I'm
Okay.
glad they put it in juice, but it's also seen as a preservative, so they'll put it in a number of different food items.
All right. So if you're not able to get your kid to drink something like apple juice or orange juice, if they'll drink water and then say like Tang, is that
Yeah,
like
it
a
would be a way to
reliable
get it. Yeah,
source? Okay.
absolutely. And they do have. I mean, I'm not advocating Hawaiian Punch, but I'm pretty sure Hawaiian Punch has it.
Right. Right. Yeah, it does. It,
So
it, it
there's a number of
advertises.
that they do add it in now.
Okay. So like pretty much what you're saying there is like it's not like the ideal situation, but if you're able to get it in them that way, it's
Mhm.
acceptable until we're able to work with these kids.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, the child at the end of the day would learn to eat foods from all the food groups and they would get all their nutrition from their diet. But you got to look at where are we at today? And if today what they'll do is drink some type of fruit juice or a punch or something that has vitamin C, okay, well, there's your source of vitamin C. That doesn't mean that you won't ever work on trying to get them to eat fruits and vegetables. It just means on this is what we have today, and at least it gets that vitamin into their system.
Mm. Yeah, because there's like a big push in health communities, and then like from like even like pediatricians, and then sometimes I even see it inside the support groups I'm a part of, where they're like discourage them from drinking these sugary drinks and da 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 da, and it's like, well, I kind of need him to do that.
Right,
He'll predominantly drink water. My son specifically actually prefers water throughout the day
right.
to other things, which is fantastic. But like I said, he'll drink an entire gallon of apple juice if you let him, which is fortunate.
Right.
Um,
And I think that probably should be the message. It's not that they shouldn't have any juice or any fruit punch or whatever. It's that you just said your child would drink a gallon if you let him. That would be the part is everything in moderation. So it's not that they should have a gallon of apple juice, but that doesn't mean they should have zero apple juice.
mm. So okay, I mean that does make a ton of sense, and it's nice to kind of have that message out there where it's like, hey, you know, I know a lot of people say this, but if this is the only way to get your kid to take it in, give it to them at least until you can start working with them. Um, and kind of like pivoting from that, something I'm really wondering about is when parents are looking at these kids, because right now a pediatrician suggested to me to get my son tested for something called ARFID. Now,
Mhm.
when you're looking at your child and before you slam the panic button and start scheduling these evaluation appointments, what are some of the differences between an eating disorder like ARFID and then like just generalized pickiness that you can work with at home without racking up a medical bill?
Right. That is where you see the um, kind of the spectrum. So if picky eating is maybe your child doesn't eat very many fruits and vegetables, but ARFID there are actual criteria for that, and there are four criteria for ARFID. Like what do they look for as diagnostic criteria for ARFID? Well, the first is if your child is either lost a significant amount of weight or your child is not growing appropriately. So they call that growth faltering. So it means your child's not gaining the weight that would be expected for their age. So if they're under the growth curve or less than the first percentile for height and or weight or BMI, then they would look at, why is that child that low in weight? Is it because there's some other medical issue, or is it because they have insufficient intake? And if it's due to insufficient intake, that's one of the diagnostic criteria for ARFID. Another criteria would be a significant nutritional deficiency. So if they do have something like scurvy or pellagra, which is a vitamin deficiency as well, that's vitamin B3 deficiency, that would be a diagnostic criteria for that. Or if you're at risk for nutritional deficiency, so you've got a diet that doesn't have any iron in it. So over the course of time, you're going to develop an iron deficiency, though. So that would be another criteria for ARFID. Dependence on tube feeds or oral supplements. So if you've got a child that is dependent on gastrostomy tube feeds or nasogastric tube feeds, or if they're dependent on drinking Pediasure, maybe from a bottle. So it's not uncommon for me to see school-age children that drink 3 or 4 bottles of Pediasure, maybe even more per day. And if that's the case, then maybe that's one of the diagnostic criteria for ARFID. So if you're not eating a food except for a supplement, that's one of the diagnostic criteria. And finally, an interference in psychosocial functioning. And what that means is your child's eating is to the point where it interferes with their daily life. An example, I worked with a young man, and he only ate food in the basement. So he was a young man on the spectrum, but he only ate food in the basement. So when he went to school, they took him to school. He went through most of his school day. They brought him home, took him to the basement. He ate lunch, took him back to school, finished his school day, came home. And so he just had all of his meals in the basement, which is problematic in and of itself, but it also is problematic for the family because it means you get to go nowhere because you can't take your basement on vacation.
Right.
So we worked on getting him to not eat in the basement. So it's, kids in general and kids on the spectrum in particular will develop these habits and routines and rituals, and they can interfere with what you're able to do. So those are the 4 criteria for ARFID. And if you've got a child that meets those criteria, then they would diagnose it as your child is having ARFID.
Right. Okay. So if somebody had something going on like the child who only eats in the basement, is that something that is preventable simply by proactively not allowing that kind of behavior, or is that something that forces itself to develop?
Well, I think a lot of these rituals, like your child only eats in the basement or your child only eats off a blue plate or whatever, very often no parent intentionally does that. They don't feed their kid in the basement so they learn to do it. It's just these things creep up on you. It wasn't too long ago I worked with a little girl who only eats out of an Incredible Hulk bowl. Well, her mom dropped it and broke it.
Oh no.
So her child wouldn't eat for a couple of days until she got a new Incredible Hulk bowl off of eBay. And I don't know if she wouldn't have found that bowl, what would have happened. But it just, these habits develop and then they kind of get into, you're stuck with it. That's what it becomes, a habit and a routine.
Wouldn't they hit that point where they're hungry enough that they'll just eat off of anything because their body is like, you need to eat?
That's the question. That is the question, because that's what that's the typical pediatric advice is that, okay, well, you go to your pediatrician and you tell him that, well, I've got the child and he's very picky, and the pediatrician says, okay, well, give the family meals and give healthy snacks, and that's it. And they'll eat when they're hungry. And I think that works for some kids, but does it work for every kid? Maybe not, because you do see kids that won't eat to the point where they end up on tube feeds.
Hmm.
And the other part is that, do you know how incredibly hard that is? If you've got a child who only eats these few things and you completely change their diet by giving nothing but what the other members of the family eat, you might change that child's diet by 100%. So what happens when kids don't eat for extended periods of time? They get hangry and they
Yes,
have
they do.
tantrums, or they exhibit all these outrageous behaviors like self-injury, or maybe throwing things or breaking things. So it's hard for parents to do that kind of advice where you just use hunger as the mechanism to get them to eat.
Yeah,
I'm not saying it's
initially.
not appropriate to do it. I'm just saying that in every situation, it's not as easy as in some situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Initially, with my son, when he first started his food pickiness, it was very strange. So he actually started, and I know I'm about to get scorned by half the community listening to me, but my son started on eating solid food with, accompanied with formula at the age of 6 months. He wanted it. He was consuming too much formula. I started giving it to him, introducing things here and there. By the time he was a year and a half, he would eat anything. And I mean, he would eat stuff I wouldn't eat. The only thing he would not eat was peas. And then one day it stopped, came
Yes.
to a crashing halt. Would not eat stuff anymore. Um, Unless it was like chicken nuggets or like some of the foods I mentioned before. And I brought it up to his pediatrician. I'm like, what's going on with this kid? He's like, I don't know. I'm like, okay, thanks. Way to put that degree to use. I need you to tell me what to do with him. And he's like, and that's what he told me. He said, make the family meal. And if he doesn't eat it, put it in the fridge. And when he's hungry, give it back to him. He will get hungry enough to eat it eventually. By the third day, several meltdowns and tantrums later, um, and also like strange bowel movements and whatnot, I was like, I used a colorful word for that, doctor, and then gave my kid the chicken nuggets and he ate because I can't,
Right.
you know,
But I think that's the hard part. It's terrifying
yeah,
because your kid's not eating. They're maybe they might be. You think they're getting weak, or they're getting pale, or sometimes they throw up. So these things are terrifying. And that's typically why we try to. I think hunger is a part of what you need to do, but it doesn't have to be the only mechanism you use to get kids to eat.
definitely. So kind of moving forward from that, what I've gathered is that unless they're showing, definitive symptoms of disorders, like if they're maintaining decent weight, if they're maintaining good eating habits, if their psychosocial activity is normal, then we're really just looking at pickiness, and we can work on that via things like therapies or different techniques. And then if there's more significant symptoms, then we're looking at a possible disorder. Did I get that correctly?
Well, yeah, if it's the severity of um, how severe is the pickiness. So
Hmm.
if you've got a child that's not gaining weight, they're deficient, they're dependent on tube feeds or supplements, then they've got this, they would meet the criteria for the disorder. If they don't, then they wouldn't. But that, even if they don't meet the criteria for the disorder, doesn't mean you couldn't work on things.
Hmm.
There are many, many kids out there that don't have a very great diet, that it would be helpful if they ate more fruits and vegetables.
Gotcha. Oh my, mine's freaking out right now. One second, sorry about this.
Sure.
Okay, he's fine. He died in a video game, was very upset about it. Uh so moving forward from that, say we haven't really reached like, dire straits, I need immediate medical attention. What are some signs that parents can look out for early on for some of the more serious ones? Like I know like pica or pica, I forget how to say it, is like if
Mhm.
he's like eating the carpet and the curtains and stuff,
Well,
or just
yeah.
random not food items. And then, like you said, with ARFID is like the extreme body weight loss and things like that. Before we get to like symptoms like that, what are some things we can look out for that maybe we can bring up to our pediatricians if we have questions?
Well, you talked about, when you started transitioning your own child off of formula and onto solid foods. If you have children that have trouble transitioning to solid foods, and maybe they'll be gagging often or throwing up or things like that, that could be a sign that maybe a sensory issue, or um, very likely it could be gastroesophageal reflux or some GI issue. If you
That
look at all the kids that come into our clinic, the biggest comorbid medical issue or medical issue that's common to all of them is gastroesophageal reflux. The second is constipation. So many kids don't eat because it's either painful, because it hurts when they'll eat and then they'll regurgitate and it'll burn their throat. So they'll either stop because of that or stop eating certain foods, um, or because they're kind of blocked up because they have constipation. It's not uncommon for us to hear that the children don't have bowel movements for 5 days, 10 days, 15 days. So if you're not going to the bathroom for that long a time, it's probably painful or uncomfortable to eat. So some kids don't, or they don't eat very much, or they only eat, again, certain things. So looking at medical issues and things that could contribute to feeding problems is probably a safe start. And if you see any of those kind of things, that's when some medical professionals like your pediatrician is always a good place to start. And then maybe on from there. Um, a lot of the referrals we get come from gastroenterology, but we also get referrals from other subspecialists, like we get referrals from hematology who see kids that are iron deficient. Um, we get kids with referrals from rheumatology who see kids that often have joint problems, which are secondary to scurvy or other deficiencies. So um, we see kids with medical issues, and if the medical issues were addressed earlier, I got to wonder that some of the feeding issues wouldn't arise.
Okay. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Again, like my son, he had issues with constipation since pretty much since we got him onto solid foods. It was a problem. We're actually in the process of seeing a GI doctor right now. Um, it was a task for us because at his previous pediatrician, how that office functioned was he didn't have just one doctor. It was we had an appointment there, and whichever pediatrician was there that day, he saw.
Right.
So he had like seven doctors, and none of them ever remembered who he was. You
Well, I
know,
think that's the hard part because you don't have any, like if you see a pediatrician, like the same person, whether it's a pediatrician or a nurse practitioner or physicians, whoever it is, and you see the person, then they kind of learn who the child is
Mhm.
and kind of can, oh, okay, they can, but if you only can look at a chart, it's hard to kind of go back over time and kind of find out what's going on with the child. So,
Right,
I mean,
right.
I can see where it would be problematic, and unfortunately, in a group practice, sometimes if you bring your child in on a Tuesday, you see the Tuesday person. If you come in on a Thursday, you see the Thursday person. So it's not always the same person over time.
Right.
But ideally, you would see one person that sees your child over an extended period, just so they get to know your child for who he or she is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it was a huge problem for us on multiple doctor's visits. I had brought up to the doctors like, "Hey, I don't know who you are, but every other doctor we've seen has heard this from me. We're still dealing with constipation. They're just like, Miralax. And we're like, we've been doing that. It's not great. Like we're not fixing the problem. There's obviously something other than him needing Miralax going on here, and they never did anything for him. We actually eventually recently switched to another pediatrician, had all of his records transferred over. It was a big old headache, but we saw this person once. They felt him up, and they were like, he needs a GI referral. Gave us the GI referral. We went to the GI doctor, and then he's got this condition where um, he has all this backup from the constipation, and it's like stretched out certain things, so his system doesn't really recognize stool anymore. And we had to do this
Yes.
clean out on him, and he's on a daily regimen of Miralax and X-Lax now until his system de-swells and is able to
Yes.
react to stool more. And I'll tell you what, after we did that clean out with him and we got all that excess stool out of him, this kid cleared my fridge in 2 days. It
Yes.
was
Kids
crazy.
that are constipated don't eat well. And then when you get rid of that, then they do get some of that gets better. But if you look at like what's the underlying reason for constipation? In the majority of children, the problem is they're not getting sufficient fiber and or they're not getting sufficient fluid. Now there are children that have GI issues like um, they've they might have a stricture in their intestine. Um, that's pretty rare. Most of the time, it's diet related and not due to some kind of functional or organic problem. Um, it's not uncommon or it's not unheard of, but it's not common. Most times when kids have um, constipation, it's due to their diet. And the big reason is they don't eat fruits and vegetables, which are the two food groups that tend to make you poop.
Right, right. I was tempted to give him coffee a couple of times just because I know what it does to me. I never I never
um,
did, but it was tempting. Like I looked at this child at one point and I was like, if I went as long as you've gone without going to the bathroom, I would be screaming. How are you running around and playing?
yeah. Well, I think that that's your doctor said that it stretches out the bowel, and that's how they've gotten used to having that there, and it just stretches the bowel to the point where the nerve endings don't work anymore, so they don't initiate needing to go to the bathroom to poop. Now that will get better as they stay cleaned out for a period of time. The bowel does shrink back in, and everything will work the way it's supposed to, but it takes time because it took time to get that way.
Hmm.
Now, like, do you know why coffee works?
No, no.
It's
Sometimes it kicks in at the most inappropriate times, but I do
well,
know it works.
yeah, yeah. The mechanism in coffee is the acid. It's
Hmm.
the acidity that makes you poop. It's not the caffeine, and it's not the fact that it's warm, but it's the acidity which makes you go to the bathroom. Um, I don't typically recommend it for children. Um, only, I mean, I guess you could give your kid decaf or whatever, but um, just I don't recommend giving kids tons of caffeine. Um, but that's what it is in adults. So plenty of adults use coffee to help them do what they got to do.
Yeah.
Um, but in kids, we typically like that is where juice can help you. The sugar in juice makes you go to the bathroom.
Hmm.
So they um, fruits that start with P make you poop, like prunes, pears, peaches, plums. So those fruit juices also can help with that. So apple juice is okay, but it's not as typically pear juice, plum juice, prune juice. Now, some kids are not big fans of the prune juice, but if you dilute it with other juice, sometimes that helps.
Okay. See, I we used to give him prune juice uh when he was much younger, like when he was only
Mhm.
eating like baby cereal, because it gave him like he would suck it down because it's a different flavor. But
Right.
now he won't touch it. He's like, this is
Right.
gross. And I'm
No,
like,
it's not.
it is
Yeah.
gross. I agree.
I mean, um, some kids are fine with it, but it's not as popular as many other things.
Okay. So if parents aren't, they say we're on the fence here, right? We're looking at a kid. It's like maybe he's got something going on. Maybe this is just pickiness. Um, do you recommend getting him checked out right away anyway, or do you recommend maybe trying some stuff at home before resorting to medical care?
Well, I mean, I think it's if you have concerns about your child's eating, you should express those concerns to your pediatrician or primary care provider. Um, and they can ask you about your kid's diet, and you can kind of decide with both the input from the family and input from your healthcare provider about what this next step needs to be. In some kids, it will be just trying to work on improving their diet at home. And in other cases, it'll be seeing some provider who's going to help you with that. Um, I think it just depends on what your goals are as a parent. I see some children that their parents are concerned about their diet, so they come and see me. Do I think they have ARFID? No, but they really could stand to improve their diet a little bit just for some of these other reasons, maybe to help with constipation, or maybe to, um, in some cases, to help manage weight. So I
Hmm.
think it's, do you have to wait until your kid's diagnosed with ARFID before you go get help? Um, no. But I think you can also, and most of these things, actually, most kids with ARFID are worked on. I mean, you're worked on in the home setting. So most of it's done as an outpatient. So you see a therapist, they try to give you some suggestions or a plan that you use in the home, and it's done that way. So it's in rarer cases, children go to maybe an intensive program or an inpatient program, but that's not as common as seeing kids on an outpatient basis.
Right. Okay. I was about to ask you about a few things to uh try at home before seeking the medical care for the parents that are kind of reluctant to run to the doctor all the time, but I kind of feel
Mhm.
like that's going to bleed directly into your book. So why don't we kind of jump into broccoli boot camp?
Okay.
um this is, you actually gave me a copy of this book, and for my listeners out there are techniques. It goes over ASD very early on in the book. It starts at page 39, and we really touch on a lot of things. And I personally found a lot of the advice and ideas in the book incredibly useful in getting my son specifically to try new foods. And right now, mostly what we're at is we've gotten past point blank refusals, and he will at least lick things now, which
Okay.
I know a lot of parents are like if, especially if there's a neurotypical parent listening to the show right now, they're like, so what, like they need to eat it. It's like, well, no, this is a huge deal for a kid with food pickiness and autism. Just getting them to lick something that has a different texture or flavor or consistency is a big deal. um but Dr. Keith, if you want to kind of go over the different aspects of your book real quick, and then we can talk
Mhm.
about the autism section specifically.
Okay. Well, the whole reason we wrote Broccoli Boot Camp is my colleague and I, Laura Seiverling, who also worked in a feeding program. We wanted to provide something for parents that they could use in the home setting. Um, the what we talked about, where you kind of they eventually get hungry and eat. We knew that that wasn't the approach for every child, so that's why we came up with different plans that parents can use. So the things that we wrote about in the book are only things that have been used in in the literature. So they're things that either us as clinicians or other clinicians have shown to be useful. So they're come from the published research. So the interventions we use have already been demonstrated to work. Um, we put different ones in for so that because we know families are different and kids are different. So we put it in for different, so families can kind of pick out what they think would work for them. Um, and we try to put in that it's not just to look at that particular mealtime, but you kind of got to look at before mealtime. Like, what are the things you need to address before you even consider changing their diet? Like getting kids to go to the bathroom, ensuring the child doesn't have reflux. So we talk about all those different things in the book because we're trying to help parents kind of set up how they can do a program at home and be successful. Um, and in the actually the copy of the book that you got is the first edition. The second edition got published yesterday for the first time.
Oh wow,
So
congratulations.
thank you. So it'll be out. I have no idea how long these things take, but they should be out this summer or this fall. So the new version, and we do go into more stuff about. We do have an extended talk on ARFID. We've got more on nutritional deficiencies. We've got even a section on how therapists can help parents. So we kind of added to what we had.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to pick up a copy of that because honestly, the first edition here has been invaluable when it's come to dealing with the frustrations of having a child who initially couldn't stop eating anything he could get his hands on to being so selective. It's like I have 7 safe foods and I can't give him anything else.
Yeah.
And some of the techniques that you go through in the book, like I even used one today. So, like I mentioned earlier, he started, he's recently started eating mozzarella sticks. Well, we were at Applebee's and he ordered chicken tenders, which, that's numero uno favorite food. And then he ordered the mozzarella sticks with it. He ate the mozzarella sticks and he wanted more mozzarella sticks. And I actually had to use there. You have a technique in there where you have the desirable food, but you want them to eat something else. So it's like a negotiation. Like if you eat that or some of that, then I'll give you what you want. And I had to use that today. I was like, listen, bud, like you have 3 chicken tenders there. I want you to eat at least one of those. You eat one of those, and I'll get you more mozzarella sticks. And that technique continues to work for my son to this day.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
good.
go ahead.
I think that's important that so you use that. Well, in the book we would call that plate A, plate B, but you made the mozzarella sticks or more mozzarella sticks contingent on him at least eating some of the chicken tender, um, which he did. And I think it wasn't that he doesn't like the chicken tender. He eats the chicken tenders,
Mm-hmm.
but he just wanted to have nothing but mozzarella sticks, which is from if you did it one time, that would be okay. But if you do that continually over time, where you just eat the same thing over and over, that then you don't tend to pick up everything in your diet. Um,
Right, right. I've learned with him that like permitting that sort of fixation, especially if it's something new, um, something we've already established is a good item, will go to the wayside and he'll start refusing that. So,
right.
like I said, I use that technique still, even though it's already a food we know he'll accept. I still use the technique because I need to break that fixation before it becomes a problem.
Right. And I think that's what you find it's pretty typical for me to talk to parents and they tell me that as their child transitioned off of formula and onto solid food, they ate a wide variety of foods. They became a toddler, they still ate a wide variety of foods. And then maybe as they went into their preschool years, their diet became more and more and more restricted over time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's kind of one of the hallmarks of children that are on the autism spectrum is that they have these restricted interests. So they get into these habits and they kind of continue them. And I think that comes in very common for feeding. So they just get these restricted number of foods that they eat or only eat foods a certain way or only eats foods at certain places. And if you go back and look in the early literature, there was a guy named Leo Kanner, and he's the one that came up with the term autism. In his early studies, where he's describing these kids with autism, they all had feeding problems. feeding issues probably should have been in the initial diagnostic criteria for autism, but it just got kind of skipped over for problems with language, problems with socialization. But feeding issues were very common, and they continue to be. If you look at studies of kids with autism, like large scale studies, many of these kids have issues with eating, and that we've certainly found that in the research that we've done over the years, and I think other people have certainly found the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. If I'm looking back at it, it really was like um, the denial of foods, like the him becoming food picky, was definitely pre most of his autism symptoms. He did do the head banging and the arm flapping before
Mhm.
that, but the rest of them didn't really start until after the food pickiness. So maybe
Okay.
that should have been a stronger indicator earlier on. Live and learn. It was my first kid. I don't know at the time didn't know anybody else with any autistic children, so I was brand new to it too. Um, but it's a really good point. And uh, something else that I really want to talk about from the section of autism in the book. It starts on page 43 with establishing a new routine. And for kids with autism and parents with autism, we know that routine is paramount to a successful day. And for a lot of children, even minor changes to routines can result in things like meltdowns and, absolute just distraught children who just can't handle themselves because something changed just a little bit. And your book kind of goes over the importance of getting into and modifying those routines and setting good ones. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And I mean, what you just said, like they have to, like, there are all these things that if you make any kind of modifications to their whatever the routine is, then they get upset about that. And certainly that's true about eating. And that's one of the things that I very often tell parents is that as you work on trying to get your child to eat a healthy diet, you're directly working on the autism because you're getting them to do things that they didn't eat the day before, eat things they didn't eat the day before, or to try things they didn't do the day before. And what you hope is as they become more flexible about the eating, that they'll become more flexible more generally. So it'll be easier to do things. If you learn to start eating new foods, they'll learn to do other things that were difficult for them that they weren't doing before. So that's one of the prayer is that not only are you getting them to eat a healthy food and getting them to develop these healthy habits that last a lifetime, but you're also working on getting them to be more flexible more generally. So that's kind of one of the rationales for why would I bother doing this. That would be one of the rationales, is to try to get them to um, kind of be more flexible about things and beyond eating.
Yeah. Yeah, I can guarantee you that people listening right here are sitting there and they're praying at night for their children to become more flexible. Do you think that starting with food is a good way to start generating those habits that allow a child to become more flexible, or do you think we should start somewhere else and then move into food?
What? Well, working on food is probably something that should be done sooner rather than later, only because that's one that you have to do. Like if you look at all the activities of daily living, like going to the bathroom, talking, tying your shoes, putting on your clothes, all those different things are important. But the only one that if you don't do it, it will kill you is eating.
Mm.
So you have to eat every day,
Hmm.
and you have to eat multiple times every day. So working on that one is going to be helpful only in that it's something you can't not do anyway. You have to work on eating because the kid has to eat every day. So
Right.
some activities you can not work on for a while. Like if your child is not talking, I mean, we want them to talk, of course. We want them to have language, or more importantly, we want them to have communication. But if you don't work on that today, that's okay. But if you don't feed your child today, that's not okay.
Right.
Um,
Hmm. So
so,
the section right after that too isn't necessarily directly pointed towards autism, but it's still something that I feel strongly relates, and that's the section about sensory issues, because a lot of times kids react towards new sensory situations um, negatively.
right.
To really put it that way, like my son specifically will, for instance, he loves Kraft macaroni and cheese. If I go get the better, like the Velveeta brand, which most people think is
Yes.
amazing, it's so much better, or homemade baked macaroni and cheese, forget it. All bets off. He will bring you the box of Kraft macaroni and cheese and look at you like, make the good one.
Right. And I think, yes, he's gotten into a habit of eating the Kraft macaroni and cheese. I don't think it's the case that he hates the other ones. It's just that they're not the right one. Um, and he's probably not familiar enough with the other things. But
Mhm.
um, yes, that is um, the kind of that's a very typical example of, how kids are stuck on these different things. And one of the things you got to look at is like, what can you do to change that part? Well, if you can get the child to taste the what you would call the good macaroni and cheese repeatedly over time, I would expect he would learn to like that macaroni and cheese. But yes, kids that are on the autism spectrum do have, in some cases, they're more sensitive to things, some cases less sensitive to things, but they've got sensory issues of some type or another. Um, but what does that mean? It doesn't mean that they can't ever learn to eat macaroni and cheese other than Kraft. It just means that maybe you something has to be something you work on. These preferences to new foods are not something you're born with. You're not born liking Kraft macaroni and cheese versus Velveeta or some other type. It's something that's learned over time. And you can learn to like new foods, or you can learn to like new textures, or new whatever sensory property of the food, new smells. Um, but that learning, it has to come through exposure and um, learning to make new associations about that particular food.
Okay, and before we move into closing out the episode here, there was a technique that you had given me a number of months ago at this point, where, like you said, like plate A, plate B, and even if like the plate B thing was less the size of a grain of rice, just to get that flavor into their mouth, that's all that matters. Can we kind of go over that technique
Mm-hmm.
real quick, and then we'll
Yep.
get into closing?
Yep. The In plate A, plate B, we're trying to give the child exposure to new food. So one plate has little tiny tastes of a new food, whatever they may be, and the other plate would have some type of food that's familiar to the child that they would want to eat. And if they take one little taste of a new food, they get a piece of the preferred food, whatever it is. Or maybe if they eat one little piece of a new food, they get the entire serving of preferred food. But what we know is that if you want your child to learn to like a new food, no matter what it is, what you need to have is repeated exposure over time. So the child has to taste the food repeatedly. It all the literature shows that the size of the taste does not seem to matter. The size of a grain of rice is equal to a size the if it's the size of your hand. It doesn't matter. You just need to taste it repeatedly over time. And if you look at the kids that are on the spectrum, many of them are very upset about new foods. So we try to make bite sizes small as to not upset them and make it easier for them, because this is almost like, I tell parents, this is like having a phobia. And what you're trying to do is desensitize them so that they learn these foods are okay, they're safe, they're tasty, and that you can eat them. So if we can get kids just to repeatedly taste, and play day is one way to do it. We've used other techniques to do it. Um, and we use modifications to that all the time. The young man that I saw today would not eat the food, but I got him to hold it in his mouth. And we started with he held it in his mouth for 5 seconds, and then he got a piece of preferred food. And then 10 seconds, and then we had him holding it for 30 seconds. And then he was starting to taste the food a little more. And once or twice, he actually ate it because it's less effort to just eat the stupid little bite of food than it is to hold it in your mouth for 30 seconds.
Hmm.
So there's all kind of different things, modifications you can make to get your child to do this. But the most important thing is that they taste the food repeatedly over time.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is because that technique specifically worked for me
Mm-hmm.
so well. I've gotten him, they're not always like great, super healthy foods, but every parent who has a picky autistic eater will take anything that they'll eat that's new. And I've got him on like 4 or 5 new foods since you told me about that. And I don't even have to negotiate with him often anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, hey, this is new. I want you to lick this. And he'll actually like lick the entire thing, not just touch it to the tip. I mean, full on dog slobber, lick it. And for me, that's a massive success when it comes to my son and eating.
Mm-hmm.
And honest to God, Keith, Dr. Keith, thank you so much for that information and giving me a copy of that book. It really has been just an absolute asset when it comes to me taking care of my son, and I really appreciate you did
Okay.
that for me. Um,
Well, I'm more than glad to do so.
at this time though, I would really like to give you the opportunity to plug and promote anything you'd like. Um, you said you just have a new copy, a second edition of the book coming out. Anything you want to talk about, let us know what it is and how we can get our hands on it.
Okay. Well, there's the book that we wrote that if you have a child that has feeding issues, you can at least look on Amazon and look up Broccoli Boot Camp. There should be a second edition coming out soon, which the cover is purple. The original cover was green. And maybe that'll help you. I mean, certainly there's other resources besides ours, but um, we did just, we tried to kind of tailor it to kids that were on the spectrum, because that's so many of the kids that we see in our clinic. So that might be something that parents would find helpful.
That's awesome. And again, I honestly, I really do recommend listeners getting your hands on that book. Um, it's worth it. Me personally, the stuff works, and anything to get some new foods in your kids. We need to get these kids eating, and we all know the frustrations of trying to make that happen. Um, Dr. Keith, I really do appreciate you taking the time
Oh,
out of your day to sit down and have this conversation with me,
oh,
to
it was
come
my
on this
pleasure.
show. Yeah, and it really is. It's such an issue and such a huge frustration point for a lot of us. Before I let you go, this is something I always like to ask at the end of every episode. Off the top of your head, what would you say is the greatest victory you've ever had with getting a child to eat new things?
Well, I mean, we've over the years here, we've worked with a number of kids. We've worked with kids that have never eaten a food in their life. They've never swallowed anything. So, working with some of those, we had a little girl from Ireland and we taught her to swallow and we taught her to eat. And the therapist went to Ireland and stayed with the family for a couple of weeks and got her to eat the communion wafer so she was able to have her first communion. So I always thought that was pretty touching.
That that really is. That's a wonderful story, and that's amazing that you guys are being contacted to travel overseas to utilize these techniques that you have
Mhm.
to get these kids to eat. Well, that's a wonderful way to end things. Again, thank you so much for your time. And, maybe in the future, especially, after the new book's been out for a little bit, maybe we can have you come back and talk to us a little bit more.
It would be my pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the Brighter Spectrum podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or stories to share, or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, feel free to reach out to me at brighterspectrumpodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and keep shining a light on the journey of parenting.
Thank you for listening.